They had forced them together. The man who needed hands and the girl who had none to offer but her own. He had not wanted a wife, not since Martha, but the ranch was dying and his son was too quiet, and the broker in town had made it sound like a simple transaction. A woman to cook and clean and salt the beef, in exchange for passage paid and a roof over her head. He had agreed without looking at the paper, only at the sum at the bottom. Then they brought her. She stood on his porch in a plain gray prairie dress that looked like it was made of dust, a small, tired girl of 18 named Lynn, with eyes that saw everything and said nothing. She carried a single cloth-wrapped bundle. Owen looked at her, then at the vast, sun-bleached emptiness of his land. It felt like he had just traded one kind of desolation for another. He didn't invite her in. He pointed toward a low-slung outbuilding, its walls stained dark from years of work. "The salt house," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "The beef is there. The barrels are there. That is the work." It was not a welcome. It was a bargain stated in the plainest terms. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze dropping from his face to the worn boards of the porch. She did not ask about the house, or where she would sleep. She did not ask for a glass of water after her long journey. She simply walked past him, her worn shoes making no sound, and went to the salt house as if she had been doing it her whole life. He watched her go, a knot of something sour and uncomfortable tightening in his gut. This was not what he had wanted. It was a complication, another mouth to feed when he could barely manage the ones he already had. He turned and went back inside his quiet house, the screen door slapping shut behind him with a sound of finality. He did not see her that evening. He did not see her the next morning. But when he went to the salt house, the heavy work had begun. The air was sharp with the smell of brine. 3 massive sides of beef were already packed in coarse salt, laid out with a precision that surprised him. The floor was swept clean. A neat stack of cut cloth sat on a bench, ready for wrapping the finished cuts. She worked with a silent, relentless efficiency that was almost unnerving. He stood in the doorway, a large man made clumsy by her quiet competence. She did not look up. She was simply a pair of hands, moving, working, salting the beef that was the last, desperate hope for his failing ranch. She was exactly what he had paid for. And yet, it felt entirely, terribly wrong. The silence in the salt house was different from the silence in his home. His was the silence of absence, of a voice gone and a space that could not be filled. Hers was the silence of endurance. The ranch was a map of Owen's grief. The main house, which Martha had filled with wildflowers and the smell of baking bread, was now just a place to sleep. It was clean, meticulously so, but it was a sterile cleanliness, the kind that comes from scrubbing away memories instead of making new ones. In the corner of the kitchen sat a small rocking chair, its wood smooth and dark from use, but no one ever sat in it. It was Martha's chair. Owen's 6-year-old son, Sam, moved through the rooms like a little ghost, his face perpetually smudged with dirt, his eyes wide and watchful. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a thin whisper, as if he were afraid of taking up too much space. He would follow his father from the barn to the corrals, a small shadow clinging to a larger one, never asking for anything, never demanding attention. The ranch itself bled sorrow. Fences sagged. The creek that cut through their northern pasture, once a reliable source of life, was running lower than Owen had ever seen it, its banks cracked and dry. The cattle were thin, their hides loose, their ribs showing. Every morning, Owen rode out and did the arithmetic of failure, counting the heads, calculating the dwindling feed, measuring the slow death of the life he and Martha had built. His younger brother, Thomas, bore the weight of it all with a bitter, stoic fury. At 16, he had the hardened hands and weary eyes of a man twice his age. He saw Lynn not as a person, but as another burden. Another mouth, he'd muttered to Owen the day she arrived, his voice tight with resentment. We can't afford another mouth to Thomas. She was an indulgence his brother could not afford, a foolish attempt to paper over the cracks that were threatening to swallow them whole. He ignored her completely, walking past her as if she were a fence post, his shoulders set against her, against the world. And in the middle of this wounded, silent household, Lynn moved with an unnerving calm. She slept on a simple cot in a small storage room off the kitchen, a space no bigger than a closet. She took her meals after the men had eaten, and she always took the smallest portion, eating quickly, silently, before clearing the plates and retreating to her work. Her world was the salt house. Day after day, she packed the meat, her small hands raw from the salt and the cold. She was a machine of quiet labor. But her eyes were not machine-like. They missed nothing. She saw the way Sam would touch the empty rocking chair, his small fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She saw the exhaustion etched around Owen's eyes. She saw the frantic, angry energy with which Thomas threw himself at his work, as if he could hold the ranch together by sheer force of will. She saw the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that fell on the unswept corners of the main room, the small signs of a home losing its heart. She was the wife he had bought to salt the beef, and she did her job. But she saw the deeper rot, the wound that salt could not cure. Her work began in the salt house, but it did not end there. It bled out, in small, almost invisible ways, into the rest of the ranch. The changes were so quiet you could miss them if you weren't looking. One afternoon, Owen came into the kitchen to find the thin, torn curtains over the window had been taken down. A few hours later, they were back up, the rips and tears mended with tiny, perfect stitches that were nearly invisible. The fabric was clean, letting a little more light into the perpetually gloomy room. He said nothing. He did not acknowledge it. But he noticed. A few days later, the persistent cough that had been bothering Sam through the hot, dry nights began to ease. Owen found a small tin cup of a fragrant, steaming tea by his son's bedside. He watched as Lynn coaxed the boy to drink it, her voice a low, soft murmur, a sound he had not heard in this house for over a year. He later found her by the creek bed, gathering the wild herbs she used for the brew. She did not look up as he rode past, but he saw her hands, carefully selecting the leaves. He had lived on this land his entire life and had never known those weeds had a purpose. It was one small thing, and then another. The chickens, which had been laying poorly, suddenly started producing again. Thomas, grumbling, had been ready to cull half of them. But Lynn had quietly started supplementing their feed, using kitchen scraps and crushed eggshells, a simple trick that brought the flock back to health. She found a patch of wild berries growing along a fence line and made a small jar of sweet, dark jam. A single spoonful appeared one morning beside Owen's plate of dry biscuits. The sweetness was a shock. It was a taste of something other than dust and defeat. Each act was a quiet offering, made without expectation of thanks. She mended a tear in Thomas's work shirt, leaving it folded neatly on his bed. She organized the chaotic mess of tools on the porch. She found a way to coax the stubborn old barn cat, a creature of pure disdain, into purring by her feet with the offering of a small scrap of salted fish. She was proving herself not through grand gestures, but through a steady accumulation of quiet competence. She was fixing the small, broken things, one by one. The men of the house did not speak of it. Thomas still held his silence, though the hard set of his jaw seemed to soften just a fraction. Owen watched her, his expression unreadable. He had bought a pair of hands to salt his beef. He had not bargained for this. He had not bargained for a woman who could see the holes in their lives and, with nothing more than a needle and thread and a handful of weeds, begin to stitch them closed. The first crack in the wall of silence came from the smallest one. Sam had been watching Lynn for weeks. He watched her mend the curtains. He watched her gentle the chickens. He watched her hands as she worked the dough for the plain bread she now baked twice a week, a bread that was somehow lighter and softer than anything they had eaten in a year. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the porch, he approached her, his small fists clenched at his sides. He held out a single, slightly wilted prairie wildflower. He did not say a word. He just held it out to her, his face a mask of solemn concentration. Lynn stopped sweeping. She looked down at the flower, then at the boy. She knelt down so she was at his level. Very gently, she took the flower from his hand. She didn't smile, not exactly, but the severity in her face softened. "Sieur," she whispered, the words foreign and soft. Thank you." She went inside and found an old empty bottle, filled it with water, and placed the single wildflower in it. She set the bottle on the kitchen table, a small, defiant spot of color in the drab room. From that day on, Sam was her shadow. He followed her to the chicken coop, helped her gather eggs, and sat on the floor of the salt house, watching her work. He began to talk again, not in whispers, but in the clear, direct way of a small child. "Cat likes you," he announced one day, as the barn cat rubbed against Lynn's legs. "He doesn't like Thomas." Lynn just nodded, scratching the cat behind its ears. Thomas was a harder fortress to breach. He saw her competence, and it irritated him. It felt like a judgment on his own frantic, failing efforts. He resisted her presence, the quiet order she brought. But he could not deny the evidence of his own eyes. He watched her rewrap a rope burn on one of the horse's legs with a poultice of crushed leaves. The next day, the swelling was down. He saw her take a broken piece of harness leather, something he would have thrown away, and with patience and a few simple tools, repair it until it was stronger than before. The turning point came without a word. He was trying to fix a loose hinge on the barn door, his frustration mounting with every stripped screw and splintered piece of wood. He finally threw his hammer down in disgust and stalked off to check the fences. When he came back an hour later, the hinge was fixed. It sat flush against the frame, the screws tight, the door swinging smoothly and silently on its path. Lynn was nowhere in sight. But on the bench nearby, his hammer was wiped clean and set next to a small tin of grease he hadn't been able to find for months. He stood there for a long time, looking at the hinge. He did not thank her. But the next morning, when he went to the well, he drew 2 buckets of water instead of 1. He left the second bucket by the door of the salt house, right where she would find it. It was not an apology. It was not an acceptance. But it was a beginning. The wall had not fallen, but a stone had been loosened. Owen noticed everything. He was a man who lived by observation, by the subtle shift of the wind, the track of a coyote, the first sign of sickness in a calf. He noticed the mended curtain, the jam, the clean hammer. He noticed the way his son, who had been a ghost in his own home, now had color in his cheeks and dirt on his knees from playing. He noticed the silence in the house was changing. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of grief. It was becoming a quieter, more peaceful silence, the kind that comes when people are comfortable in each other's presence without needing to fill the air with noise. He watched Lynn from a distance. He saw the toll the work took on her. Her hands were chapped and red from the brine, and her shoulders were stooped with exhaustion by the end of the day. Yet she never complained. She never asked for help or for a moment's rest. She simply did what needed to be done, her small frame housing a strength that seemed impossible. He had bought her to be a drudge, a functional object in his failing enterprise. But she was stubbornly, quietly, a person. The knowledge sat uneasily within him. One evening, he came in late from a long ride, chasing a stray that had wandered miles from the herd. He was bone-weary, the familiar ache of defeat settling deep in his marrow. The house was dark except for a single lamp burning in the kitchen. Lynn was not there, she had likely retreated to her small room. But on the table, next to the bottle with Sam's wildflower, sat a tin cup. Steam was still rising from it. It was the same herbal tea she made for Sam. He hesitated. It was a simple thing, a cup of tea. But it felt like something more. It felt like a question. He walked over, picked up the cup, and drank. The tea was warm and soothing, chasing some of the chill from his bones. He drank it all, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, the lamplight throwing long shadows on the floor. He felt the tight knot in his chest loosen, just for a moment. The next morning, Lynn came out of the house to find the rickety top step of the porch, the one she always had to step over carefully, had been replaced. A new, solid plank of wood was nailed firmly in its place. Owen was already gone, riding out to the north pasture. It was his answer, spoken not in words, but in the language he understood best, the language of work, of repair, of making something solid and safe. He had fixed the step. It was a silent reciprocation, a conversation held in wood and herbs across the divide of their separate solitudes. The house was still wounded, but for the first time, it felt as if it might one day heal. A second cup had been offered, and a broken step had been mended. The first sign that something was wrong beyond their own misfortune came from the creek. It was the ranch's lifeline, and it was dying. Owen blamed the dry summer, the relentless sun that baked the land into a cracked and dusty plate. But Lynn, whose life had been spent observing the subtle languages of water and earth, felt a different kind of wrongness. One afternoon, she walked the property line, following the dwindling stream toward its source on the neighboring land. The land belonged to Mr. Davies, a man whose ranch, unlike theirs, seemed immune to the drought. His cattle were fat, his pastures green. Davies was a frequent visitor, always stopping by with a kind word and a face full of sympathy. "A terrible season, Owen," he'd say, shaking his head. "I don't know how you're managing." His concern was as smooth and polished as a river stone. As Lynn neared the fence that separated the two properties, she noticed something odd. The flow of the water, already a trickle, seemed to almost stop entirely. She pushed through a thicket of willows and saw it. It was not a large structure, nothing a man would call a proper dam. It was a subtle, carefully constructed blockage of rocks and packed earth, almost indistinguishable from the natural creek bed unless you were looking for it. It was just high enough to divert the majority of the creek's sluggish flow into a smaller channel that led directly onto Davies's property. It was clever. It was quiet. It was theft, disguised as nature. She stood there for a long time, hidden in the willows, her mind working. This explained the unnatural health of Davies's land. He wasn't lucky, he was taking their water. She filed the image away, a cold, hard piece of knowledge. To speak of it now would be to invite a fight Owen could not afford to have. He was a proud man, and to be openly bested by a neighbor would break something in him. So she said nothing. She returned to the ranch, the secret heavy in her mind. A few days later, another detail that did not add up. Davies rode over, ostensibly to see if they needed to borrow any feed. As he was talking to Owen, Lynn noticed a fresh tear in the leather of his saddlebag. It had been crudely mended with a piece of bright green twine, the color jarring against the dark brown leather. It was a small, insignificant detail. But her mind, trained to see patterns in the weave of a cloth, registered it and held it. Green twine. A hidden dam. The pieces meant nothing on their own, but she stored them away, like seeds planted in the dark, waiting for the right conditions to grow. The wrongness had a name, she suspected, and that name was Davies. His pleasant smile and concerned words were a mask, and she had just seen the first glimpse of what lay beneath. The summer deepened into a brutal, brassy season of heat. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, empty of clouds. The creek slowed from a trickle to a series of stagnant pools. The grass in the pastures turned the color of old straw and crackled underfoot. The drought was no longer a threat, it was a siege. The cattle grew leaner, their moans more plaintive. Owen and Thomas worked from sunup to sundown, hauling water from the nearly dry well, their faces grim, their movements frantic. Panic was a low hum beneath every action. They were losing. But weeks before, when the creek had first started to run low, Lynn had begun a project of her own. She had watched the way the land sloped behind the barn, noticing a shallow depression where the ground was always last to dry. In the cool of the early mornings, before her work in the salt house began, she had taken a shovel and a bucket. She dug. It was slow, back-breaking work. She deepened the depression, shaping it into a wide, shallow basin. Then, she walked for miles along the creek bed, gathering the heavy, dense clay she found there. She carried it back, bucket by bucket, and began to line the basin, pounding the clay down with her feet and a heavy piece of wood until it formed a smooth, impermeable layer. Owen and Thomas had seen her, of course. They thought she was digging for roots, or perhaps engaging in some strange, pointless ritual. They were too consumed by their own desperate labor to ask. She was just the Chinese girl, doing something strange in the dirt. Then the rain stopped completely. The last of the water in the creek bed evaporated. The well was producing barely enough for the house. The cattle began to fall. One evening, Owen came back to the barn, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He had lost 2 calves that day to thirst. "It's over," he said to Thomas, his voice hollow. "There's nothing left." That was when Lynn came to him. She did not speak. She simply tugged on his sleeve and led him behind the barn. In the fading light, he saw it. Her shallow basin was no longer empty. It was a small, placid lake, holding hundreds of gallons of water. She had caught the runoff from the last small shower weeks ago, the water that had simply evaporated everywhere else. Her clay-lined cistern had held it, saving it. It wasn't a river. It wouldn't save the entire herd. But it was water. It was life. Owen stared at the cistern, then at Lynn, her small frame covered in dust, her face streaked with sweat. All those weeks, while he had been fighting a losing battle, she had been quietly, patiently preparing for this very moment. Her hidden depth, the knowledge carried from a land of droughts and hardship he could not imagine, was laid bare. She had built them a reservoir of hope, one bucket of clay at a time. The water from Lynn's cistern saved the weakest of the herd. It was a reprieve, not a victory, but it was enough to rekindle a flicker of fight in Owen. Davies noticed. He rode over a few days later, his eyes lingering on the small group of calves drinking from the trough Lynn and Thomas now kept filled. His smile was as pleasant as ever, but his eyes were cold. "Remarkable," he said to Owen. "I heard you'd lost a few. Glad to see you've pulled some through." He paused, stroking his horse's neck. "Tell you what, neighbor. I know you're stretched thin. I'll take 5 of those calves off your hands. Pay you a fair price. Just to help you out." The price he offered was an insult, barely a third of what a healthy calf was worth. It was a predatory offer, a kick to a man already on his knees, but it was disguised as charity. Owen's pride flared. "They're not for sale, Davies," he said, his voice tight. Davies just shrugged, his smile never wavering. "Suit yourself. Offer stands if you change your mind." He tipped his hat and rode away. 2 nights later, Owen was woken by the frantic lowing of the herd. He and Thomas raced out with lanterns to find a long section of the north fence had been cut. The wire was snipped cleanly in 3 places. A dozen of their best remaining cows, including the calves that had been saved by the cistern, were gone. Their tracks led straight across the dry pasture toward Davies's land. The threat was no longer subtle. It had escalated from a hidden theft of water to an open act of rustling. When Owen confronted him the next morning, Davies was the picture of innocence. "Your cattle wandered onto my land," he said calmly, not a flicker of guilt on his face. "Fence must have come down in the night. Poorly maintained, I suppose. By law, they're my strays to claim now. But since we're neighbors, I'll hold them for you. For a fee, of course." A boarding fee. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He had stolen the cattle and was now charging Owen to get them back. The fee he named was impossibly high, a sum he knew Owen could not pay. It was a checkmate. Owen stood there, defeated, the dust and the injustice settling on him like a shroud. He had no proof. It was his word against a respected, prosperous landowner. He saw the smug certainty in Davies's eyes. He had been outmaneuvered at every turn. The ranch, his home, everything he had fought for, was being dismantled piece by piece, and the man doing it was smiling at him. Lynn knew. She knew with a certainty that settled cold and hard in her stomach. It was Davies. The cut fence was not an accident, and the wandering cattle were no coincidence. It was a deliberate, calculated move to break Owen and seize his land. While the men raged and despaired, she began her own quiet investigation. She did not announce it. She did not ask for permission. She simply moved through the margins of the crisis, gathering the truth one small piece at a time. She started at the fence. In the early morning light, before anyone else was awake, she walked the line where the wire had been cut. She ignored the cattle tracks and focused on the ground nearby. And there, pressed into a patch of dry, brittle earth, she found them, boot prints. They were not Owen's worn-down work boots, nor Thomas's smaller, patched ones. These were from a newer, more expensive boot with a distinctive star pattern on the heel. She knelt and studied them, memorizing the shape, the size, the depth. Then, her eyes caught something else. Snagged on the sharp end of the cut wire was a single, tiny thread. It was bright green. The same green twine she had seen mending the tear on Davies's bag. She carefully worked it loose, her fingers gentle, and wrapped it in a small scrap of cloth she took from her pocket. It was a fragile piece of evidence, but it was something. It was a connection. Her next stop was the hidden dam. She slipped away in the midday heat, taking the path through the willows. The dam was still there, but the earth around it looked freshly disturbed, built up even higher to capture the last dregs of the underground flow. At the edge of the muddy bank, half hidden under a bush, she found more prints from the same boots with the star on the heel. He had been here recently, tending to his theft. She now had the twine and the boot prints, connecting Davies to both the cut fence and the stolen water. It was a story, but it was a story with no witnesses. She needed something more. She thought of the quiet ranch hand, a man named George who worked for Davies, an older man who rarely spoke and always looked tired. She had seen him in town once, his face etched with a worry that went beyond the drought. She found an excuse to walk toward Davies's property line again a few days later, carrying a basket as if she were foraging. She saw George repairing a fence. She approached him slowly. He watched her, his expression wary. She didn't speak of the cattle or the water. She simply looked at him, her gaze direct and calm. "It is hard," she said quietly, her English still halting. "To work for a man who makes you do wrong things." George flinched, his eyes darting back toward the Davies ranch house. He looked at this small Chinese girl, who should be powerless, who should be invisible, and he saw that she knew. He licked his dry lips. He told me it was just to scare him," the man mumbled, not looking at her. "Said he'd give the cattle back. I didn't know he'd do this." He had been there. He was the witness. She had all the pieces now. The weight of the stolen cattle pressed down on the house, suffocating what little hope had been left. Owen was a ghost, moving through his chores with a dead-eyed resignation. Thomas was a storm of silent fury, slamming doors and throwing tools. The fragile peace Lynn had cultivated had shattered. In this house of broken men, she felt more like an outsider than ever. Her place here was conditional, a bargain made of desperation. Now that the enterprise was failing completely, the bargain was void. Her presence was a reminder of a hope that had died. In her small room, her original cloth-wrapped bundle sat on the floor beside her cot. It had been there since the day she arrived, never fully unpacked. It held her only other dress, a small pouch of coins that amounted to almost nothing, and a carved wooden comb from her mother. It was her exit, kept ready. Every night, she looked at that bundle and felt the pull of the road, of disappearing. It was a familiar feeling, the habit of a life spent being moved from one place to another without her consent. To be ready to leave was to have the only power she had ever known. The question of whether she would stay hung in the air, unspoken. She had no claim to this land, no right to this family. She was a paid hand, and the work was gone. One evening, the tension in the house became unbearable. Owen sat at the kitchen table, staring at a letter from the town sheriff. It was a formal notice. Davies had officially registered his claim on the stray cattle. Owen had 3 days to pay the exorbitant boarding fee or forfeit them entirely. It was a death sentence for the ranch. He dropped his head into his hands, a gesture of complete and utter despair. "His one," Owen whispered to the table. His one Sam, sensing the terrible finality in his father's voice, began to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the dirt on his cheeks. Thomas stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid. Lynn stood in the doorway, her heart aching for them, for this place that had almost, for a moment, felt like a home. She looked at Owen's bowed head, at Sam's tears, at Thomas's rigid back. Then she looked toward her room, at the bundle waiting by her cot. She could walk away. No one would stop her. It would be the easiest thing to do. But as she looked at the broken family in the dim lamplight, she knew she could not. She had gathered the truth, and now she had to use it. She walked not to her room, but to Owen. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes hollow. "I can help," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question. It was a statement. In that moment, the packed bag in her room lost its power. She had made a choice. She would not run. She would fight. The meeting was set at the sheriff's office in town, a small, stuffy room that smelled of dust and stale coffee. Davies was already there, sitting in a chair as if he owned it, a look of smug confidence on his face. He nodded politely to Owen as he entered, a victor's condescending grace. The sheriff, a weary man named Miller, looked from Owen's defeated face to Davies's composed one. He sighed. "Owen," he began, "Mr. Davies has filed a legal claim. The law is pretty clear on strays. You have proof this was anything but." Owen shook his head, his jaw tight. "It's my word against his, and my word," Davies added smoothly, "is that his fences failed and his cattle wandered. An unfortunate accident it was then that the office door opened." Lynn stepped inside. Behind her stood Thomas, his expression grim but resolute, and behind him, looking terrified but determined, was Davies's ranch hand, George. Davies's smile faltered. He stared at George, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" he demanded. Lynn did not look at him. She addressed the sheriff, her voice low and steady. She laid her small cloth bundle on the sheriff's desk. She unrolled it. Inside was not a dress or a comb. It was the small, bright green piece of twine. "From Mr. Davies's bag," she said, her English careful and precise. And from the cut fence next, she placed a piece of paper on which she had carefully sketched a boot print. "This print is at the fence. It is also at the creek, where the water is stolen." She spoke without anger, without accusation. She simply laid out the facts she had gathered. Davies scoffed. "This is ridiculous. The word of a hired girl and some string." But Sheriff Miller was looking at the evidence, his expression thoughtful. He was looking at George, who was sweating, unable to meet Davies's furious gaze. "George?" Miller asked, his voice quiet. "You have something to say?" George swallowed hard. He looked at Lynn, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He took a shaky breath. He made me cut the fence," George stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He said it was just a scare. He promised he'd give the cattle back. I saw him do it. I was there." The room fell silent. Davies's face, which had been a mask of confident authority, seemed to collapse inward. The color drained from it. He was no longer a respected landowner. He was just a thief, exposed in a dusty room by a quiet girl, a scared ranch hand, and a piece of green twine. Owen, who had been standing silently by the wall, moved. He walked across the room and stood beside Lynn. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. He just stood there, a solid presence at her side, facing the sheriff, facing Davies, together. The lie had been laid bare, not by violence or shouting, but by quiet certainty. Davies was finally, truly seen. The cattle were returned that same afternoon. Sheriff Miller, a man with a quiet sense of justice, also made it clear to Davies that the unnatural blockage in the creek would be removed by sundown. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. The heavy shroud of defeat had lifted, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of relief. The ranch was still poor, the future still uncertain, but it was theirs again. That evening, a real quiet settled over the house. Sam was asleep, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Thomas was out in the barn, the rhythmic sound of his hammering not angry, but purposeful. Owen sat at the kitchen table, cleaning his rifle, his movement slow and deliberate. Lynn finished washing the last of the dishes. She dried her hands and walked to the doorway of her small room. Her cloth-wrapped bundle was still there, a silent question mark. She reached for it. Lynn Owen's voice stopped her. It was the first time he had spoken her name not as a label for a worker, but as her own. She turned. He was standing now, his face unreadable in the lamplight. He looked at the bundle in her hands, then at her face. The air in the room was thick with everything that had never been said between them, a year of silent observations, of small kindnesses, of shared hardship. He had bought a wife to salt the beef, and she had saved his home. He had seen her as a burden, and she had become its foundation. He took a step toward her. He was a man of few words, a man who spoke with his hands, with repaired steps and mended fences. But he knew this moment required more. "Stay," he said. The word was quiet, rough, and it held more weight than 1,000 promises. It was not a command. It was a plea. He reached out and gently took the bundle from her hands. He walked over to a high shelf in the kitchen, a shelf that held old jars and forgotten things, and he placed her bundle there, putting it away. He turned back to her. He walked to the table, where 2 cups sat. He picked one up and held it out to her. It was an echo of her first offering to him, the cup of tea that had been the beginning of the thaw. She took it. This dying cattle ranch, once a monument to his grief, was now something else. It was a place of quiet strength, of stubborn endurance. It was becoming a jewel of their own making, polished not by wealth, but by resilience. It was becoming a home. Thank you for watching.